Welcome to this, our fourth in the series of lives as part of Beta's Feed Fact Fortnight. This year, our theme in the spring is very apt. It's feeding the competition or performance horse. And tonight, we're talking about a subject that I think will be close to everyone's heart, especially with this beautiful weather in the beginning of the season. We're talking about feeding your competition horse when you're away from home. And joining me this evening is Alan Lincoln. Alan is the nutrition manager at Simple System Horse Feeds. It's been with them 5 years and is going to cover a range of topics to do with when you're competing away from home. Alan, welcome this evening. Thank you for giving up what is a stunning evening.
Yeah, it was a lovely evening, but no, happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
So I think last weekend a lot of people were out and about. If people are thinking about going away from home, so competing a bit further afield or just taking their horse away from home to compete, what sort of things should they be thinking about when it comes to their feed?
Yeah, of course, there's lots of things, like you say, to think about before you even, put your show entry in, and before you even travel. It's assessing your horse. It sounds really basic, and yes, it's not perhaps feed related, but are they fit, sound, happy, healthy? I think sometimes we get so het up on actually going away, we forget to just look at the horse and get out of the habit of just trotting them up the morning of. The last thing you want to do is get to a show when they're already not quite right, and then you don't know if they weren't right that morning or they did something on the lorry. So it's just simple checks like that, checking they've eaten their breakfast before you take them. Did they eat and drink normally overnight? Because obviously with the weather at the minute, it's so warm. If they've not drunk well enough overnight, and they're already traveling a bit dehydrated, we want to make sure we're really hydrating them through a day when we're away from home as well. So thinking about things, are they normal? Are they eating up? Have they got a good appetite when they're even before traveling, and then when they get to a show as well? And with sort of your individual horses, are there any changes that you need to make before you take them away? Do you need to start phasing in something like a calmer if they can get more anxious when they travel? Do you need to think about, electrolyte or salt provision if that's not something they're normally on? If they are prone to, ulcers, are you making sure they've got plenty of forage that they're going to keep eating when you're traveling, or when you then get there, are they going to eat something then? And also, I think a key one as well, if you're obviously competing, is just making sure that the feeds, the supplements you're giving, that they are, competition safe. Are you using things that, are with the Beta NOPS code? Have you been on any supplements or medications that might actually need a bit of a withdrawal period? So making sure that you're factoring that in. You don't want to get the day before a show and realise you perhaps should have stopped feeding something a week ago, as it were. So there's all checks, you can do even in the lead up, to a show before you even get, to that day of actually competing.
And do you have to think about the amount of energy they'll need? Do you automatically assume they're going to need more energy, or should you have been adjusting their feed up to the time you actually leave?
Yeah, great question. And like you say, it sometimes come down to those individuals. Some of them take, harder competition work in their stride. They'll be absolutely fine what they're on all the time. But some horses that maybe do get a bit more stressed and anxious, perhaps even they don't travel very well, so they're, using and burning more energy before they even get to a show. You might find that, like you say, you need to be gradually increasing that feed the week before you go, so they've almost got a bit in reserve. Some people might even use a slightly different feed when they're at a competition, because perhaps their horse is quite, say, backwards at home just because it's relaxed, and then at a show it's actually a bit hotter, so it's naturally got more energy anyway. Or the opposite, they get quite tired when they get to a show and they do need feeding up. So again, it's just kind of knowing your horse, and sometimes you might not get it right the first time, and that's okay. You might come home and think, oh, I really needed more energy, when I went out on the cross country phase, or actually I had far too much and they were jumping out of my hands the whole time. So then you just, tweak it the next time. And sometimes I think even keeping a record of what you fed, what did work, what didn't work, did you have enough energy in that phase? And then you can make a plan for next time to get it right, as it were. So it can be trial and error.
And if you are thinking of making some changes, so you're thinking, I'm going out to a competition next weekend, I know I'm going to have to change a bit of his diet, how far in advance should you think about putting that in?
Yeah, it's like with anything, like you say, perhaps, with a feed change, you want to be making it, over a period of 5 to 7 days. And I think that goes for, even say those like forage changes. Quite a lot of people, just for the ease of transport, might say feed haylage at a stay
Yeah.
away show because it's cleaner to travel in the lorry than taking a bale of hay with you. And sometimes actually the extra fluid intake from haylage being that bit damper can obviously help if they don't drink so well away from home. But obviously, if that is a new forage type that they don't normally have, you definitely want to be phasing that in. Like you say, that the week before, you don't want to be making any sudden changes, literally the day of going to a show. It's just, too much in one go for them. We know that, digestively, it's, only going to increase their risk of developing problems, God forbid, colic even, if you make changes too drastically. So.
And how much, this may seem a funny question, but I was listening to some coverage post Grand National, and they were saying that some of the horses didn't come through as well as they expected because the temperatures, I mean, the weather was fantastic. How much do you have to think about the weather conditions, either as you're traveling or when you get there? How much of a difference does, like the weather we've got now, super, not particularly hot, but definitely better than we'd normally expect?
Yeah. I think, like I say, and definitely if it's been, warmer than the horse would be used to, it's definitely keeping that fluid intake up. If you can, feed a soaked feed, you might want to, not necessarily say soak your hay, but at least dampen it, or, consider using some haylage so that you're just naturally getting more moisture into them through their diet even. And certainly if they are poor drinkers, a really good thing to use can be just some straight beet pulp. Because beet pulp, when you soak it, I mean, most will soak, say, 5 times their volume of water. So even if you're adding a mugful to their daily feeds, well, that's then 5, mugfuls of water on top, as it were. So you're just naturally increasing their fluid intake without them having to drink as such.
Yeah.
It's a common problem a lot of us face, that their horses just don't drink well away from home. As much as you can take, your own water in your own buckets and everything, some of them are still just, a flat no, will not drink. So if you can find a flavoring they really like, or adding a handful of feed to a bucket of water, anything that just tempts them, you do just really want to watch that fluid intake when it's warm, and it can only help to, like you say, not overhydrate them, but keep them well hydrated the day before the day of traveling, and just really keep an eye on that. It's almost sometimes more important than them eating well, because being dehydrated is such a limiting factor for performance in itself. So they need to be well hydrated when it's warm.
And it's interesting what you said, the idea of taking water away with you, which somebody else mentioned that a couple of weeks ago, and I would never have thought of doing that. But
Yeah.
that some horses really do like the taste of home, don't they?
Yes. And I think sometimes with those stay away shows, you do almost want it to be a home from home. So you do want to keep things, as similar as you can to how their home setup would be. If they're staying in a, strange stable, we'll still try and put things in the same place, as it were. So, it's still familiar to them in that sense. Try and keep to their, same routine as much as you can with when you would have fed them, when you would have given them some quiet time, things like that. So again, it's not too much of a change. They have, it's kind of a scenario they're still used to, as it were.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So we've checked everything out. We've got the feed all lined up. Lorry's packed and we're ready to go. When they're actually traveling, what are the main risks, and how can we help reduce them?
Yeah, of course. So obviously it's a major thing for, respiratory health, as it were, getting these confined kind of stuffy horse boxes. You want to keep, good airflow as much as possible. That is sometimes a case for trying to use, a low dust forage. Obviously they should always travel with some sort of forage, a hay or a haylage. It probably would be a time when you do want to perhaps, use haylage just because of it being lower dust, or a steamed hay, something like that. So there's less, respirable particles kind of going around the box anyway. Kind of tie it as low as you kind of safely can, because obviously they've got naturally better drainage when their heads are lower, and obviously you don't want them tied so tight they can't actually put their heads down to breathe and clear themselves a bit. If you are going on long journeys, obviously they say, kind of actual breaks, say every 4 to 6 hours to get them off. But I think sometimes even if you're traveling, say 2 or 3 hours, if you can even just safely pull over and, your horse is good in a box, it can be an idea just to untie them and let them put their head down, maybe offer them some water, offer them a soaked feed, especially if it's warm. You really do want to be trying to keep them hydrated, but allowing them to get their head down to, keep their breathing track nice and clear as well. And it just gives them a bit of a break as such. So.
And I think some people are a bit hesitant about feeding on a journey, would you always say give them something to nibble on while you're traveling?
Yeah, absolutely. I would always say, because travel in itself is such a massive risk factor for giving them ulcers. You really do want them to be eating and chewing and, saliva production as much as you can throughout there. And I mean, some horses won't eat when they travel. My horse is one of those, he goes on the box and he's just traveling, doesn't matter what you hang up, it's not there to him as such. But if you've got a horse that will pick on a net, I think that's, always to be advised. And then if you do use, a forage feed or a forage based chop, you're perfectly safe to give that around travel as well. Because, digestively, it's still going to be processed the same as their hay would. So there's not that, digestive risk of, say, feeding a more cereal based feed close to what is effectively a piece of exercise. Because I think people forget that with travel, it's as strenuous as them doing quite a decent walk. And if you've got say a horse that doesn't even travel well at all, they're going to be burning up that bit more energy. So you don't necessarily want to be giving a cereal based feed around travel, but certainly forage as much as you can, really.
It's interesting, one of our viewers has just popped in a comment saying that she actually soaks a fiber brick in a large amount of water, and her horse, who's not a drinker but like yours, is happy to eat that. So that's another really good suggestion.
Yeah, really good idea. Like I say, anything that just keeps fluid up, keeps them chewing. Ultimately, that's what you want as well. So yeah, really good idea.
No, absolutely. So you've got to the venue, big tick. Horses come off, big tick, safely and sound. What now?
So I always think, like I said, with the breaks, good to get the head down as soon as you can. That might be, obviously offer them a drink of water as soon as they come off. See if they have naturally got a thirst response. If not, have a bit of a soaked or a well dampened feed for them there. Certainly if, the venue's not on grass, have feed low down, offer them some hay as low down as you can, just to get them, head down, kind of clearing, let them, naturally calm down, taking all the sights as it were. And, if it's got, a bit of grass that you feel they can safely pick at, then that's fine as well. Just keep them moving for a bit so they're not going to stiffen up if they have been stressing themselves out on the box as well.
Yeah, no, that all makes sense. We talked about them going off their forage. Do some horses go off their forage and their feed? And what can you do if they really are fussy when they're away, even though you've done everything possible to give them exactly the same?
Yeah, literally sounds like my horse, unfortunately, for some reason, as soon as he's away from home, it's just, food's not there to him. He's just, in the focus zone or, too stressed, bless him, and doesn't eat. So I found with him, I actually do have to feed him something different away from home. I have to go for something that is just a little bit more palatable, a little bit, naturally sweeter with a bit of a higher sugar level, just because his normal feed that he has at home that's very low in sugar is just not tempting enough to him when he's got the buzz and the atmosphere and that. So, it's always worth checking, what else your feed company that you use can offer, really, whether they do perhaps do a complete feed that's got more flavorings in, or something that is just naturally that bit more palatable, because I think it's quite a common problem for people that their normal feed is then just not enough of a drive. I know a lot of people with that kind of do reward based training, you're always after that higher reward, as it were, and I think sometimes you do have to do that with your feed itself, if you have got one that's quite fussy. And lots of people that where perhaps they won't eat their forage as well, they'll look to then other forage options. So it may well be that they do then use a haylage or a hay and haylage combination. Perhaps their hay supplier does do something a little bit richer that maybe they don't need all the time at home, but actually when they're away, if it's just that bit more tempting, again, because perhaps it's a bit more nutritious, it just encourages them a bit more.
And is it sensible to do a lot of hand grazing? Is there any risk in doing hand grazing, or should you try to do some?
I think, like you say, if you're certainly at a venue that's got, grass access and, you're allowed to take your horses out, then, it's always to be encouraged. One of the main risks really is just kind of the disease risk, if anything else, with strangles being so rife. You don't want to kind of be grazing too close to other horses that you don't know or near other horses' droppings. Ideally, you might, have even had your horse vaccinated, for something like that. So ideally, I think, it's just being mindful of the disease risk really when you're actually grazing on grass. Is it suitable grass for your horse to be eating? But absolutely getting their head down to grazes, definitely to be encouraged. And if they've been out, at home, that's going to be a major dietary change if all of a sudden they're, you know, not getting any grass at all. So it certainly helps keep things moving for them.
And when it comes to actually feeding them prior to competition, I know it's a topic that a lot of people debate. When should you feed them? What time period, and what's the ideal solution when you're considering both the forage and the bucket feed?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously forage is something that you can have available to them, you know, all the time. And certainly if you do use forage feeds or a forage chop, again, that's something you can feed, you know, right up until the point you get on board, as it were. So you're quite safe to feed them very close. Lots of people will use, you know, a lucerne chop or perhaps a soaked forage brick, you know, have them chewing on that when they are brushing them off, tacking them up. So yeah, sometimes that might be an extra feed, or actually if you've got an early class, they might be having, you know, their normal breakfast, as it were. Obviously, if you're on a more cereal based regime, you want to just be mindful of leaving enough gap for them to, you know, have been able to eat before they've had a suitable time, you know, before doing their work. So
And what's the advantage of continuing that? I know it might seem obvious, but why should you continue to feed forage right up until the time that you get on? Because years ago, you felt you needed to give a gap.
yeah. No, absolutely. Like you say, the benefit of feeding forage beforehand is obviously it's going to help them create a kind of fiber mat in their stomach, so that when they're working and, you know, acid is sort of splashing around, there's less chance of it splashing on those unprotected kind of upper regions of the stomach. We're really finding that if you do feed forage directly beforehand, you can create a bit of a buffer. And if you are using something that is, you know, lucerne based, that's also a really good natural buffer of acid in itself. So that can just help, you know, counter those kind of work related, you know, risks of ulcers, really, of just physically working on an empty stomach. And then it also ties into giving them a bit of an energy provision as well. You know, it's not quite comparable because obviously digestively we're very similar, but you know, we're different, sorry. But if you know, we're going to go for a run, you wouldn't go for a run on an empty stomach. You know, you would fuel yourself before you went out. So it's just being mindful of that, I think. And you can't really expect them to work well if, you know, perhaps they're hungry and haven't eaten for a while.
Yeah, no, exactly. And then on the other side, so you've done your event, or you've done the competing bit of your day. What can you do to aid recovery? And is it okay to, again, give them feed straight away?
Yeah, of course. So obviously everyone has, you know, kind of their own routines with, you know, kind of either keeping the horse moving, you know, cooling them down, things like that. Again, it goes back to if you have got, you know, grass, by all means allow them to graze, you know, allow them to kind of naturally do that until their heart rate comes down. Really good again for, you know, breathing if you can get their head down and keeping the respiratory tract nice and clear. And it will just allow them to kind of slow down more naturally if they're kind of grazing and moving, rather than you know, expecting them to come back to the lorry, you know, and stand still with their head up as such. It's not so good, you know, even just for muscle recovery, as it were. You want kind of some gentle movement while you're cooling them off, especially if it's warm. Obviously they can, you know, offer them a drink again. You might find that they don't want to drink immediately, whereas some are brilliant, they come back and, you know, head straight in a bucket. Some people offer kind of plain and salted water, so that they've got the option of, you know, both, because as much as we need to rehydrate them with fluid, we also need to top up, you know, salts if they've been sweating. So it can be quite a good idea to offer both, and you might actually find that your horse does, you know, clearly prefer salted water for a time, and then will go, you know, naturally back onto plain water, as it were, when they feel they've topped up that element of the diet. So, you know, that's really good to do both as such.
And I know, we've had a question from Judith. Are you not worried about colic if you're changing your feed when you're away from home?
So is that, I assume that's possibly with my own horse, that I do feed
Yeah.
him something different on those days.
Yeah.
So because he's on an entirely forage-based diet anyway, it's not actually a massive change. So he will be having some elements of those feeds, you know, naturally day to day anyway. So it's not a huge dietary change for him because it's still from within the same feeding system. So I think that's kind of the thing to be mindful of, that perhaps the feed you do change from needs to be similar enough to your current one. So like you say, you're not then massively changing it from one day to the next.
Yeah, and I know you'd commented somewhere else, I saw, that about getting the horse's heart rate back down to normal before you put them
Yeah.
away.
Yeah.
Why is that so important? What can it mean for his long-term health?
Yeah, exactly that. Like say recovery is so important, you wouldn't yourself, go for a run and then just sit down sort of thing. You need to naturally bring your heart rate down, allow your muscles to recover. It kind of helps with that, lactic acid clearance, things like that does start helping with, muscle recovery if you don't just suddenly sit still. It's a bit like doing your cool down afterward, when you do your stretches and things like that. Obviously horses can't go off and do that for themselves. We have to,
I'd like to
do
see
it
it.
for them, as it were, sort of thing, because some will just want to land in a heap. And I worked hard, mum. I just galloped around a cross country course, as it were. So you do actually have to keep them moving, and it's really important. It helps with blood flow, everything like that. So
Yeah, and I think that's a really good idea. Put yourself in their shoes, so to speak, and what you do for you, you should be doing for your horse as well.
I think that's the thing. We're not, say, digestively comparable, but actually as an athlete, we do have similar requirements in terms of, warm up, cool down, how we rehydrate, recover, things like that. You can certainly, draw comparisons from what an athletic human would do as to what an athletic horse does need.
And what if you're away and your horse, either something happens to your forage or your horse eats a lot more than you expect and you're running out? What will you advise people to do? What should they, if faced with possibly running out at an event?
Yeah, it's certainly tricky. I mean, obviously, it depends how far away from home you are, whether someone can pop back in a car if they've been a spectator, if you know that you've got, say you're there on the first day and you think, I'm not going to have enough for the week. If you've got a friend perhaps coming up, ask them to bring something with you is always helpful. If there's people there that seem to be well stocked, and sometimes even show organizers will have, the basics available, or perhaps there's a feed store down the road that you can just pop to. Lots of them are often, linked to, say, farmers or feed stores and things, and so many venues now often have shops on site even, so see what they have that's similar to what you have. Even if you can't necessarily get hay, if you can get, say, a grass pellet, or as we touched on earlier, a forage block or something like that, so that again it's still similar for them, even if it's not the same hay they would normally have. It's still the same grass type or something at least. So digestively you're just keeping that risk low.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And then once you've got back home, hopefully with one of the red ribbons, like the one sagging behind you, should you just go back straight into the usual routine?
I think that's the thing, isn't it? Some horses can sometimes need a bit of a taper off, as it were. Certainly if you have, say, increased their feed beforehand, or they're a horse that does actually work really hard for you, you sometimes might find that they do need then higher levels of feeding when they're back home, just to help with that recovery, avoid them then dropping any weight afterwards. It's quite common that, certainly, at the top level, they will be weighing their horses, before and after an event and seeing, just how much they did lose. And sometimes it can be really quite, incredible how much weight they do lose just through, say, a single event or a single race or something like that. So certainly some horses can need higher levels of feeding when you get back home, that you might then taper off again over a period of a week or so you're making that gradual change, say, back down to what you were on previously.
And I suppose, as you mentioned before, if you keep a record and you're going to be going out, then you can actually track what happens.
Absolutely, yeah. And like say, not all of us have the beauty of having a weigh bridge at our yards, but even just a weigh tape, things like that, keeping a bit of an eye on them, doing your body condition scoring, even taking photos, before you go, when you get back, just to, because the problem is when you see your horse every day, you don't sometimes pick up on those subtle changes. So I think, keeping a bit more of a record can really help. And like you say, then you can compare back to, he really dropped weight when we did that 3-day show. I've got another one coming up. I'm going to need to feed him even more next time, or something like that.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. Just to close them, are there any other aspects that you feel people maybe don't necessarily consider when it comes to traveling?
I think, like I say, I think people do underestimate just travel in general, how much that can be a piece of work for the horse, and kind of allowing adequate time for recovery. Don't literally travel to an event and your first class is 10 minutes later, sort of thing. Give your horse time to, say, settle in. And I'm sure we've all been there, running late, traffic problems, it happens. But as much as possible, you do want to give your horse time to mentally settle in, physically recover from travel, and have then an adequate warm up for their work, allow time to be able to give them a feed, give them a break, let them get their head down, stretch out a bit, and then they should be more supple and willing to work as well anyway, if they've not been rushed around as such. So
I think that's a really good point. I think we do underestimate. We think, well, they're standing on the trailer or the lorry. How much can that take out of them? But as you say, it's the nervousness or the stress that's related to
Absolutely.
it.
And I think it's perhaps not until like I have a horse that does travel very badly, so I do have to really factor in enough time, because I know that he's going to turn up and be tired because he's worked himself out so much on the box, bless him, that needs that time. We're not all fortunate, to have horses that do just stand there and eat as such. So
Like
I think when you
mine,
have, yeah,
they do. They're
just got to take
exactly
that.
like that. But I
Yeah.
did have one before that would almost inevitably get her off the trailer, and she'd start to colic,
Oh no, God, what a worry. Yeah, it's awful,
which
isn't
was a
it?
nightmare. And
Yeah.
how do you cope with that? That's really difficult.
Yeah, another thing, like you say, touched on that actually. I had a horse that did colic at a show because he hadn't been to the toilet. Bless me, hadn't weed all day because he travelled, didn't want to wee on the box, got off and was just a bit shy in front of everyone. And allowing them to find somewhere soft to just go for a wee, I think, is sometimes something that you need to allow in. Certainly with so many shows that perhaps the car park is, say, on like a hard standing. If you
Yeah.
can get them to a soft place, or if they will, go in shavings, or train them even to go in a bucket or something, as some people do, it's a really important consideration, because like I say, that can make them really uncomfortable. So
Yeah, that's really true. Really, really true. So just to close down, what would you say are your 3 top tips when it comes to feed and competing away?
yeah, I think it's like you say, know your horse, and like you say, really know what works for your horse, and don't be afraid to get it wrong the first time. I've had friends that have gone, completely got the energy levels wrong, and it's really affected their results, but you'll know for next time, as it were, what works. So definitely keep that record, and yeah, know your horse. I think you can never kind of overfeed forage at things like this. If you can really keep their hay intake up, or a hay replacer if they won't eat feed, just eating something is better than nothing, because it's going to keep digestive tract flowing, is going to keep fiber and fluid up, so that can really help. And then I think, yeah, the other one is, again, just don't underestimate travel, and do really pay attention to your horses when they're traveling, and make accommodations if they do find it hard work in itself.
No, brilliant. Really, really common sense. Really great advice. Ellen, thank you so much. Hopefully we've equipped everyone with all that information, so when they do head out, they'll make a success of it. Thank you ever so much.
Oh, no worries at all. Thank you.